All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Club of Eugene, September 20th, 2019 program, Building Workforce Housing in Eugene.
And I'm Kaarin Knutson. I'm an architect and an urban designer and the project lead of Better Housing Together, as John mentioned, which is a community initiative that's working to collaboratively address housing affordability, diversity, and supply. And the needs of our workforce is an incredibly important part of that effort. We care about housing as a community, so how can we demonstrate that care in action? These are really some of the biggest questions that we have to ask ourselves right now. What strategies can we pursue? What policies can we pursue that would support families, individuals, working families to increase their stability and to increase housing affordability in this community? So I'll share some thoughts about efforts that are underway in Eugene and that have been underway here for a number of years, but also some recent work from around the state and some approaches that are being pursued in other communities, because every community is grappling with this challenge of affordability and how to set foundations that will allow for a future that has increased access to opportunity and chances for individuals and families to thrive. So I said the word foundations, so to talk about workforce housing, I want to pause and ask you to think a little bit about cathedrals. And specifically, I want you to think about a concept I was introduced to earlier this week, which is cathedral thinking. And I think it's a beautiful way of capturing a community's willingness and ability to begin work on an enormous task and an incredible challenge, even when they're not exactly sure how they will get to that finish line. And they're not sure if it will be in a year, in a decade, or even in their lifetime. But it's work worth doing, and it's work that we need to do in facing all of the kinds of structural challenges that are upon us. If that's the housing crisis, climate change, social injustice, homelessness, it takes courage to begin the work, to try new ideas, and not to be distracted by the scope of the problem. So that's what we're trying to work on locally. And when I think about the future of Willamette Valley in Oregon, I think this idea catches me. It's part of being truly invested in place. And when we're thinking about investments in our community, that relates directly to how we are also looking to pay forward that same opportunity for others to then invest in this community and invest in place. In saying all of that, I also want to be clear that in focusing today's conversation on workforce housing, that by no means diminishes the importance or seriousness of other aspects of the housing crisis in this community, particularly the issue of homelessness, sheltered and unsheltered. Research has clearly established the link between communities with a scarce and inaccessible housing profile such as ours and the high incidence of homelessness, and we need to, of course, continue that work with urgency. But to address the structural crisis we face with housing, we have to be able to do more than one thing at a time, and we have to care about more than one issue at a time. And housing for our workforce and low and middle incomes is an incredibly important part of that. So in Better Housing Together's work, we always try to talk about affordability and diversity and supply of housing, those three issues together, because we have to use those issues together and work on those three issues together in order to address this crisis. And here's a little bit of background maybe about those three terms and how they relate to households earning lower and median incomes. One is the idea of housing affordability. And Henry provided a lot of background to that issue and how it presents locally in our workforce. Housing affordability is a function of housing price and income. It is different from affordable housing. It's talking about what is accessible and available to you, housing you can afford based on your income. When there's very little housing available in a community and very little diversity of housing available in a community, that has a very negative impact on the affordability of housing, because people with more resources will compress the availability of housing in that market, which will then drive affordability further out of reach for many people. Based on historical nationwide averages under healthy economic conditions, the rule of thumb used to be that you would be able to afford a house if its price was equivalent to roughly 2.6 years of your household income. If you purchased a home in Eugene maybe 30 years ago, that could have been true. Today, that number is 5.1 years, which makes it not a relevant reference point for people attempting to build equity in housing in this community. And it's important also to remember that affordability is about more than just the cost of the housing. The location of the housing is incredibly important. Currently, 60% of a median household's income goes to housing and transportation costs alone. In a state with incredibly high childcare costs, that leaves almost nothing available for the other needs of that household and families. Historically, our workforce housing was situated in places where it would be easier for workers to access their jobs, most typically along public transit of some kind. And it's another reason why our local efforts to support 20-minute neighborhoods and walkable neighborhoods is so important. To deliver increased affordability, we also need to design towards affordability, and that will mean smaller homes and more energy efficient homes. This is part of the benefit of missing middle housing or micro housing or micro dwelling. The idea that these homes cost less and use less energy to build and also to maintain over time. And every year, using less energy to operate, they emit fewer carbon emissions, and the residential sector is the single greatest opportunity for us to impact carbon emissions. Why is that? It's because when you think about the area of land we are occupying, more than 90% of urban areas with our residential uses of land, when you increase the efficiency across that amount of area, even just a little bit, even one ADU on each block, you see enormous returns on that simple investment. In terms of diversity, a lot of what has happened related to housing in the last year in Oregon has had to do with encouraging diversity. The Oregon legislative session concluded with several new laws that were written to support increased affordability, to protect renters from no-cause evictions, and to address the statewide housing crisis. House Bill 2001 allowing or re-legalizing duplexes in single-family neighborhoods was one piece of that work, and that bill's component that also states that missing middle housing should be allowed is going to be a big piece of what Eugene has to do, what this community has to work on in the coming years to implement. It is a state law that is designed to help us grapple with these challenges, and now we have the responsibility of doing the work to implement them sensibly on the ground, with the goal being to provide more housing, to increase affordability, and to provide more shelter to more people who need it. That was at the state level, but locally there's also been a lot of other work underway related to housing diversity for some time. In 2018, about a year ago, the Eugene City Council initiated a public process that lasted about 4 months of workshops with a stakeholder group of close to 40 people, I believe, to grapple with the issues of housing affordability, availability, and diversity at all income levels. This was a very diverse range of perspectives that the City Council brought together, and I think their goal was simply to find out what kinds of things do most people want for us to work on? Where do they see opportunities? And these were builders, educators, social service providers, young professionals, architects, myself, business leaders, environmental activists, a very wide range of perspectives in that room. And what came out of those recommendations fell into 3 broad categories. The first category was to remove barriers to housing in the land use code. And because the analysis of our existing code found that we're pretty inflexible in terms of actually allowing the types of housing that many of our policies say we want to encourage. Smaller, more energy efficient, infill housing. We have a lot of work to do to get our code in line with those objectives, and there's a process underway with the city's code audit to try and make more sense out of that regulatory structure. The second set of recommendations had to do with reducing the cost and time burden for development of housing units. What the analysis found, and the conversation also through discussion in that work group, is that we are not very good at delivering housing units on the ground in this community. There's still a lot of conflict around whether or not we actually think the unit of housing is a good idea. The building of a home is a good idea. The having of an ADU, is that a good idea? We think it's a really good idea, and there are a lot of good reasons for that if your goals are sustainability, affordability, sociability, support of communities aging in place, financial stability for families and households of all different types. So this work group was very clear that we needed to move forward in removing some of those barriers and burdens and trying to be more efficient in our delivery of housing units. And then third, there was a lot of recommendations around increasing the inventory and supply of capital A, capital H affordable housing. And that really has to do with specifically focusing on policies and efforts that would provide more explicitly and permanent subsidized affordable housing. So lastly, a little bit about supply and also about other ideas that we might pursue to encourage these three things. Where does most of our workforce housing come from? Most of it comes from the housing that was built 20 or 30 or more years ago. Most of it is housing that has aged in this community over time and become more affordable over time. It was mostly built by the private sector. It is likely apartment buildings, small quads, little apartment blocks or fourplexes that you might see on some of our older streets. And it has been an incredibly important part of meeting our community's housing needs over many decades of time. Different households have transitioned through that housing. In terms of supply, we are far behind the curve, and in other ways connects back to some of what Henry was saying regarding our present housing needs and the supply of housing from 20 and 30 years ago. That same recession in the 80s also impacted the housing that was being built here locally and the affordability of that housing as it's available today. So just lastly, and we will talk more, I think, in the Q&A about other strategies that we might pursue. These issues steer us back to affordability by design, doing more work in our community and in our policies to support housing that can be achieved and built by both the private and public sector at a lower cost in its first instance, and all of the different types of programs and initiatives that we can pursue that would support that. We have to make it easier to get what we want. We need that kind of clarity in our policy work around housing. And we are excited to keep working on that in the years ahead. So we'll look forward to your questions, and hopefully I'm sure there will be some good ones.
You talked about what we're doing here in Eugene to solve these problems. What can we learn from other communities? What are they doing that we haven't worked on yet?
That's a great question, and as we talked about, every community across the country is struggling with this issue. Not every community across the country is dedicating themselves to trying to address this issue, but the communities that are seeing progress. And I think that looking at some of the best practices or the paths that seem to be working could be very helpful to us. I would say in the research that Better Housing Together has done, the most inspiring projects that we have come across in other communities are very clearly stated initiatives that connect both elected representative leadership with business communities and nonprofit organizations, social services, the whole range of community interests, and make a clear sort of moonshot statement about what that community is trying to accomplish with regards to its housing. And how that presents in other communities is, the sort of Mayor's Housing Innovation Lab in Boston, or the work that Philadelphia is doing around equitable development and planning. I think for Eugene, three things that we could think about, and this absolutely applies to Lane County as a whole, is steering our efforts towards diversity. We do not have the diversity of housing that we need in this community to support the community that we have, both in terms of workforce, but also our younger people in this community and our older members of the community. And that diversity of housing type supports a diversity of neighborhood and a diversity of community. And these are issues that we are trying to address and to see progress on. If we build the physical environment that supports us in those efforts, we will see greater progress. So steering our efforts towards housing diversity. That looks like some of the programs we have in place already, so for example, the city's multi-unit property tax exemption program, MUPTE, includes now a workforce housing requirement as a component of that program. That's a program we have in place. It is used occasionally. There's currently a project that is hoping to have that program support in order to be built in downtown Eugene. The purpose of that program is to fill in the gap between what is financially feasible and what a project is proposing to do. But that's already in place. What are other things that we might pursue? The other big category of work that communities are pursuing in terms of housing diversity has to do with addressing regulatory barriers that are unproductive, delivering education to the community to help people like this conversation today understand how housing diversity supports their interests and their hopes for community, and creating incentive programs related specifically to walkable communities, transit-oriented development, missing middle housing, and accessory dwelling units. We have talked a lot about those three things, transit-oriented development, missing middle housing, and accessory dwelling units over the last couple of years. Now we need to do the work to actually encourage the delivery of those homes into this market. Two other things that also relate to the first, expanding equity. Programs that focus on stabilizing home ownership and expanding access to home ownership are very effective when trying to support our workforce and build opportunity within those households and families. And then, of course, increasing resources and looking to the programs and the levers that we can pull as a community to bring more funding to some of these incredible challenges, because the workforce is not just a sort of separate segmented group within the community that doesn't interact with affordable housing or with market rate housing, but all of our policies need to see the connections between those things.
Well, thank you.
Ruth Demler, member. I didn't hear either of you mention RV parks. And now what I consider robbery is happening in our community. In Glenwood, Springfield has announced that all RV parks, once they're sold, must be emptied. That could mean thousands of homeless people on the street. Some of the people have lived there 30, 40, 50 years. What are we going to do? And I know St. Vinny is trying to buy up RV parks and on the outside and fix them up and include more people. But we need to do more than that. And as a community, I would like your suggestions.
That is a difficult question. There are, I think, a lot of layers in that relative to policy actions, and I think some good news is that this last legislative session did also look at increasing funding to support and also provide some alternatives for some of our, I think, lowest income households who are in a very unstable housing situation, what you're describing in that case. I think it speaks very clearly to the lack of alternatives that we have in this community, to the absence of a place to go to when you lose the housing that you've relied on, or an absence of choices that are appropriate for your or your household's needs. And so when we're thinking about actions and policies and community efforts that support housing diversity, it's that range of alternatives that support stability, that encourage investment in place, and that give people a chance to make it through momentary crises and avoid long-term crisis. That's pretty critical to the work we have to do as a community. I don't have a simple answer to that particular question, but it's related to everything that we're talking about.
Randy Prince, City Club member. I don't particularly have much faith in supporting through incentives more single-family or owner-occupied homes, condos, any of this. The support we've given in the past has made the home ownership of the 60% of the population privileged, an enormous wealth-generating mechanism, put down a small percentage, and in a market like ours, the gains are great, and with other things like mortgage tax deduction. As far as increasing supply to the point where rents, the market would actually drive prices down, I would ask if we looked at manufactured homes where instead of $200,000 construction cost minimum, and they are less of an incentive for the investment of the trillions of dollars of home equity around the country, people who don't necessarily need a wage job. How many thousand units of manufactured homes in this area would actually make a dent to bring the price of workforce homes down, where the lot cost is small, the construction cost is a fraction of site-built homes. How many would you propose that we build instead of the current policy, which is eliminating, as in Glenwood and throughout, to build, would actually affect the market to bring the price of of occupied rentals and owner homes? How many thousand units would we need here in Lane County to add instead of continuing to take away?
Maybe just a little bit of context. There's been some research done in the past couple of years, and Eco Northwest shared a report that basically identified that we're, I think, close to 200,000 housing units behind the needed supply in the state of Oregon. That's moves to 300,000 when you account for in-migration. And I'm summarizing a huge report and putting those numbers together. What that looks like locally, I mean, Henry talked about the lack of housing production relative to previous years that we've experienced recently. And I think one of the clear ways that that impacts the availability of workforce housing is that when we don't build those units 20 years ago, they are not available now as a more affordable option. When we don't build those units 30 years ago, they're not available now. So there are several different ways to measure types of units that we're trying to supply in the market. You know, goals of providing 600 units of affordable housing or providing for 1,600 people who are experiencing homelessness. I think in terms of affecting the broad market of housing, the best thing we can do is make sure that we're making a concerted effort to deliver significant housing supply, and that most of that housing is meeting this median demographic need, because that's the housing that will be most accessible to more people as it ages over time. And that's where the missing middle policies, the accessory dwelling units, all of these pieces become so important in steering housing policy.
Manufactured homes are
Next.
Todd Boyle, City Club member and retired certified public accountant and UO alum and all that stuff. There are 20% of Eugenians, 20% of our neighbors who are trying to live on less than $1,000 a month. And for many, many years, their available housing has been decreasing, not increasing. And so as a result, these people have been continuously displaced out of town or to homelessness. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau says that 17,000 people move here every year, and this is the city, and 2,000 stay, and 15,000 people leave. But those are the low-income people, and the people who stay tend to be higher-income people. So gentrification and inflicting this terrible stress on people being displaced. So my question is, what is Better Housing Together doing for the bottom 10% who can only afford $300 a month? And that's a capital cost of $50,000 a year, not $100,000. That's $50,000 a year will get you a mortgage for $300 a month that 20% of Eugenians can afford.
Hopefully clear in saying Better Housing Together being a community-led initiative. We have 50 partner organizations and businesses that we are working with in this effort. Our goal is to work collaboratively to address housing affordability and diversity and supply. Part of that is participating productively in conversations about how we provide for our most vulnerable residents. And part of that is also advocating for how we make sure that more people do not fall into that category. So there are many organizations locally who I would look to as our absolute experts on the issues that you're describing, and who I would look to as the clearest voice of advocacy for those issues. I think the best things that Better Housing Together is doing right now to address that issue is very clearly advocating for simple implementation of state law that would allow people to have an accessory dwelling unit clearly incorporated on their property. That can be a unit that is 800 square feet, that can be a tiny house. There is work we have to do as a community about being clear that we support housing options, and that we as a community also care about providing that housing to people who have fewer resources. So that's something that we're working on right now, and we hope that others will join in that effort. The City Council was talking about accessory dwelling units in Eugene just this past week, and I think needs to hear clearly from opinions from the community about how that type of housing could be a part of moving our efforts forward.
Carmel Perez-Snyder, I'm with AARP, and I'm a member of City Club. The question is for both of you. As our population ages, and we are aging, by the year 2030, 1 in 5 adults will be over the age of 65. What will that impact, and how will that impact the need for housing options in Eugene and Lane County?
It's a great question and takes us right back to that those points about diversity of housing options. We need much more housing in this community that is suitable to households of just a couple of people, not to single families, an expectation of 2 parents and a couple of children in that home. I think Eugene Springfield, we have almost 140,000 people who are over age 50. That means they're heading towards the years when no longer there are children in the home with them. And there are also really significant and somewhat startling statistics attached to how much savings the average American has relative to the equity that is in their home. So when we're thinking about the aging of this community, the opportunity to provide for, say, younger families, people in that demographic Henry just mentioned, 18 to 35, who may want to be moving somewhere, to provide a housing alternative for those long-term residents who've set down roots, who want to stay in the community, but do not want to care for a family home and a large parcel with yard work every weekend, that is part of this discussion and these policies. So incorporating more of the missing middle housing, duplexes, triplexes, quads, small apartment buildings, townhouses, row housing in our existing urban land, this allows for people to be a part of the community and remain a part of the community that they've been a part of for years or decades, which we know to be the best long-term sort of sociability and health scenario. But it also allows for the housing that they had lived in previously to be available to someone else. So as this community ages, we need more housing that is suitable to smaller households, and we need to think about how that can support the next generation of people who are wanting to have this be their home.
Cliff Gray, City Club member for quite a while. Anyway, I have one problem with what you say the trickle-down value theory. Has been in effect for 100 years, and if it was truly effective, we wouldn't be having this problem now. So I kind of differ with you on that very strongly. Plus, the workforce, the housing workforce ignored completely the incredible increases of rents that have been going on. The rents are rising 11.76% in Eugene last April, 13% for Springfield, and they keep going up, which makes rentals themselves, which you want to build in abundance for middle class, unsustainable. So my question to you is, what happens to the lower income people who are going to be displaced? Are we going to throw them out of town? Are we going to watch a parade of homeless circle the city? And how are we going to deal with that in a concrete manner?
There are a lot of serious questions wrapped up in that question. I'll try to answer a couple of them. And I want to be clear about a few things. I was not meaning to imply, and I don't think I said at all, that there is a vision of the work that Better Housing Together is doing that is not concerned with the real issues of this community. And by that I mean housing affordability and diversity and supply across all income levels, and that supports the broad needs of the people who are here. So that I just wanted to be clear about. I think it's also important to understand that when we talk about the median income in this community, we're talking about a household income that Henry described as being below the state average. And it's, I'm sure, related to the wages and the jobs that you're thinking of. So when we're talking about delivering housing that is accessible to those median incomes. It's why the affordability by design is so important, because those households with that income are never going to be able to afford a $300, $400, $500,000 home, the $3.4 million home the previous gentleman just mentioned. We need to do a much better job with our policies of creating pathways to build more housing that is more broadly affordable. Housing is inaffordable. Rents are so high because there is so little housing available. The market is high because the supply is low. That's a very simple concept related to these issues. If there is more supply of housing available, especially if that new housing is delivered at median incomes, that will dramatically influence, or at least improve significantly, the path that we are on with our housing policy. Where we're headed right now is to not a good place. We are already in a crisis, and it will only get worse if we don't start to steer these efforts towards something that is more equitable and provides more of that missing middle income housing, rent and to own.
Emily Semple, City Club member. I'm bringing this interesting idea from one of my table mates. Since 3/4 of housing needed is low cost and workforce, why not require only low-cost housing development and guarantee that and guarantee affordability with a deed restriction?
It is an exciting idea, but I have a few thoughts about where it may run into some problems. But I think you all know what those problems are. It costs money to build housing. Lumber costs money, concrete costs money, labor costs money, windows, mechanical systems, any number of things. I'll put in a short plug that, again, the more of our housing that we can move towards energy efficiency over time, the lower those costs over time will be for the people who live in those homes. But the scenario that you're describing would simply require really significant public investment in that outcome. What you're describing is essentially an expansion of our affordable housing efforts to incorporate workforce housing broadly and middle incomes, and it would just mean bringing significantly larger financial resources to that challenge. It's why this challenge is so difficult, because again, the families, this missing middle, right, who you would be asking for that funding are the very families who are struggling currently with stability in the market that is so difficult. It's a really challenging political nut to crack, but the path to the future you're describing is simply more funding or a publicly funded building culture, so to speak. It would not be nearly as efficient or cost effective as the skilled trades that we have in place in terms of using them to deliver this housing. One interesting aside to that is that with the passage of Measure 102 last year, the Portland Housing Bond that was passed the year before just recently announced that they have exceeded all of their targets as a result of the passing of that policy change. So really, really great example. You can find out more about that just by going to the Oregon Housing Alliance Facebook page or website. But a really good example of how steering our policies to better integrate the public and private sector response and to bring more energy, more resources to these issues is the path to better outcomes. That's at least what we're seeing bared out in significant number for significant families just to the north in Portland.
Ty Bruce Zimmerman. I'm a City Club member as of today. And I was curious about demographics. Roughly half of our population is rent burdened, with the 60% of renters and 30% of homeowners, meaning roughly half is not. And I was curious if there are any distinct demographic differences between those groups and what demographic groups might be disproportionately burdened by this problem we're facing.
I think probably the easiest example is folks who bought their homes many decades ago in a different housing market, essentially, are much less likely to be burdened. If you look at demographics on units without a mortgage, for example, through the census. So definitely an age distinction to be made there. And then as well, everything that goes along with that. The folks who lived in Lane County 30 years ago aren't the same as the people that move in yesterday. So there's an equity element to that. And so it's tough to, again, kind of change that overnight. But that's something that we need to be aware of.
There's also a really significant difference in the access to opportunity that has been available in this community with regards to paths to homeownership over the past many decades, really sort of in the history of the United States, and that as we're thinking about policies and programs that expand equity, we are also thinking about expanding opportunities to communities who have been historically underserved by our housing efforts and by our communities, and specifically homeownership among communities of color. Certainly, of course, homeownership among immigrant communities much lower than people who are white and have been in those communities for a long time. So there's definitely work to do on simply the sort of opportunity and access half of this equation.